I still remember the sound of her voice on the phone that night, the way it cracked on the word sorry, like glass breaking, and how for a second, everything that made up my idea of family shattered along with it. If you want the short, brutal version, my brother told me he'd been sleeping with someone else for years while his wife raised their kids, and when I told her, the whole family turned on me instead of on him. But the short version doesn't hold the edges, the whiteness of the nights I paced the kitchen, the smell of frozen coffee, the small, corrosive decisions that built up into the moment I chose to stop carrying this secret. I want to take you back, step by step, because revenge isn't always fast or cinematic. Sometimes it's a long, ugly, patient thing that arrives because you finally can't stand the weight of what's been tolerated anymore. And before I go any further, if you were in my shoes, what would you have done? It began ordinary enough. My brother and his wife had been married 10 years. They had kids who ran like wild things through my mother's house, sticky hands and freckled knees, the kind of children you think of when you hear family and imagine landlines and backyard barbecues, and the small domestic disasters that knit people together. From the outside, their life looked like the sort of ordinary that convinces you not to pry. He was a travel nurse. That detail matters because travel nursing is both noble and convenient. It pays well, but keeps you away. He'd taken assignments out of state for months at a time, and when he came back, he'd spend afternoons on the couch, the TV running like a low, obliging presence. People make excuses for absence when presence is messy. That's how it starts, the small normalizations. She let herself go, he told me, meaning wait. Meaning she stopped wearing the kind of clothes he liked, meaning she stopped trying to be desirable the way he wanted. She didn't help enough around the house, he said. She wasn't the same. He blamed her for their slipping marriage, and in the same breath admitted to lying, stealing the bed away with someone else. When he confessed, I sat at my kitchen table and felt like my own life had been knocked off its axis. He wanted absolution, or at least I think he wanted me to understand. He painted a portrait of a marriage frayed by distance and a partner exhausted from single parenting and jobs that never stuck. He sounded tired in a way that's hard to fake. I listened for a long time, longer than I should have, cataloging his excuses like a forensic accountant, so later I could decide whether there was anything salvageable. There was this other woman, he said. It had been going on for a while. He felt alive around her. He blamed her for his weight gain like that explained away intimacy with someone new. He asked me to give him time, to let him tell the truth himself. You have no idea how telling someone you love that they've been betrayed sits in your chest. It's heavier than you'd imagine, like carrying a boulder no one else can see. I told him no ultimatum at first. I let him keep hope. 3 months. I gave him 3 months to do the decent thing and tell his wife. I was tired of him pointing at her alleged failures and pretending infidelity was a symptom instead of a choice. That's important. Infidelity is a choice, not a disease. It's easy to lean on someone else's faults to sanitize your own. The 3 months passed with the dull ache of watching him keep laughing with the other woman in the kind of posts people post to keep their hearts lighter than they feel. He came home smelling like someone else's perfume. I watched his kids, bright and trusting, and I felt anger build like a slow tide. I told myself patience was moral. I told myself that maybe truth would come clean on its own. But summer arrived, and he never told her. He went on living in the gray area between accountability and cowardice. So I did it. I told her. I can still see her sitting on the porch in fading sweatpants, the fate-light afternoon sun making her hair halo like a cheap filter. Her phone buzzed and she smiled without looking, because that's what we do in families. We keep the small rituals of kindness even when life is falling apart. I called. Her voice was bright. She loved like a sunbeam, loved the world without asking why. I didn't know how to prepare her. There is no manual for the exact words that will break someone open. I spoke them the only way I could, plainly, like a factual report, because the truth is its own explosive device, and I didn't want to confuse it with dramatic language. I told her he had been sleeping with someone else. I told her it had been going on for months, maybe years. I watched the color leave the screen through the audio and the way her breathing changed. She cried. More accurately, she let out this guttural sound that wasn't quite a sob, like a rusted hinge that finally gave. She confronted him that night. She didn't scream at first. She was too stunned. Later, the quiet would be full of things like orders barked and accusations, but at the beginning, there was only the sudden seismic silence between them. He left, or she made him. He moved in with his parents. That should have been the end, but it wasn't. Here is the thing. When a secret is spread across a family like a hand-me-down, passed from lip to lip, the responsibility diffuses. It becomes a hot potato everyone pretends not to want. I found out, slowly and with increasing nausea, that my parents and a handful of cousins and old friends knew. They had known and chosen, for reasons that smelled like avoidance and loyalty and cowardice, not to tell her. That's where the fracture grew. I went from sad to indignant to furious, in rhythms that felt shameful. I am not proud of the small satisfaction when the picture of my brother at someone else's kitchen table popped up on the cousin's social feed, and I could feel the world tilt. A family event came up, a barbecue meant to be neutral ground, and it was there that he confronted me. He didn't yell. He spread his hands like he was showing me they were empty. "Why did you do it?" he asked, the accusation sweetened by a kind of hurt he wore like armor. I left. I didn't want to be the provocation he cast me as. The next day, Dad called me into the study, the one with the old books and the family portraits that still had my grandmother's smile. He sat like he'd always sat when things were important. He said, "We're family," which was shorthand for a lot of things, not least of which was his version of morality. Family loyalty above all else. He told me that because my brother was family, I should have kept my mouth shut, that if I knew and said nothing, maybe it would have been easier. When I asked him why he thought that way, why secrecy was preferable to truth, he avoided the question and turned the conversation to reconciliation. That was the last straw. The idea that protecting someone who had actively betrayed his wife was worth more than telling the person who'd been wronged. If you've ever loved someone and watched everyone else rewrite the moral calculus to spare their feelings, you know the particular panic that comes next. There's a moral loneliness where you realize you have to decide whether you will accept that your family's sense of protection extends to those who have violated their own vows. That night, I lay awake thinking of his kids, their homework sprawled on the kitchen island at Christmas, the way they used to climb into our laps like we were safe harbors. I decided that family couldn't be an excuse for complicity. If family means protecting a person from the consequences of their actions at the expense of the people they hurt, then that family is corruption in a different costume. I wanted more than an accusation. I wanted accountability, and I wanted to carefully, painfully expose the rot that allowed this to go unreported. The revenge I planned was not about violence or spectacle. It was about letting truth do its work in a way that would make the refusal to act, impossible. I wanted him to lose the social permissions that had let him get away with hurting someone who trusted him. I wanted the people who knew to feel the shame of their silence. That was the core of it, to shift the moral consequences onto the shoulders of everyone who had smiled and said nothing. I wanted the scales to balance. My plan had layers, like an onion that needed careful peeling so it wouldn't splatter my face. First, documentation. People are prone to say, "He told me," and "she said," and "it's complicated," because words are slippery. I began compiling dates, texts, photos, anything that could stand up under scrutiny. If you ever find yourself on the wrong side of a secret, evidence is the only neutral language. I had the conversations where he told me about the other woman, recorded where possible with consent in states where it's legal, screenshots of messages, the travel logs of when he'd left the state for those lucrative nursing assignments. I called friends and quietly asked if they'd seen anything, politely, because the last thing I needed was to appear as some sort of vengeful zealot with only a memory. People were nervous. Some lied. They said they knew nothing, because telling would mean choosing up sides. Others, quietly and with obvious shame in their voices, confirmed details.
The process was a slow unspooling of shame. Imagine digging a grave with a teaspoon. Slow, relentless, fingers cramped.
Second, timing. There's power in timing. When you expose someone too early, people deny. Too late, and they've built their own mythology. I watched their calendars. I observed when his wife traveled for work, which park the kids visited, who took them to soccer. I chose moments when the truth would land not as a rumor, but as a clear, inconvenient fact that could not be smoothed over. I wanted the exposure to land in daylight, in the open, not in some whispered back room. Third, allies. I sought out people who had quietly been frustrated with the family's tendency to protect the aggressor. That included one of my mother's older friends, a woman who has always been blunt and who had quietly told me once over coffee, "If someday someone you love does something unforgivable, do not let them make you complicit." She was a minor figure, but she had social capital. I found a couple of cousins who had felt the same way but were afraid. They became my witnesses, not because I needed corroboration as much as I needed witnesses so the family couldn't coalesce and rewrite reality the moment it was inconvenient. There's a peculiar courage that comes from telling the truth when the group voice tells you to be quiet. That courage needs company. I provided that. We rehearsed what we could say, how to hold the moral line without getting sucked into the family's defense machine. Obstacles came like rain in a storm, relentless and relentless. My brother blocked me on everything, which was a small childish thing, but symbolically huge. He had the moral clarity to silence the person who refused his narrative. Our parents oscillated between calls where they begged me to think about the kids and cold silences that stung worse. One of my cousins called and tried to guilt me, saying that families break when secrets are aired. "We'll always be family," she said, and I heard it as a threat to my own moral integrity. There were nights I cried, not from the pressure but from the loneliness of being the one willing to make the hard choice. But there were also nights I felt a quiet, stubborn righteousness because someone had to upset the apple cart. And then the resistance ratcheted. My brother threatened to take me to court for defamation. An empty threat because everything I held was documented. The other woman's name is worth noting because people love to make the unnamed into monsters, was in reality another human braced inside her own complications. I debated whether to name her publicly. I decided against it. Exposing the affair's existence was not the same as obliterating someone's life. I wanted accountability, not cruelty. Besides, my fight was not with the anonymous face of temptation, but with the lying, with the choices he made, and how the family conspired in silence. I started small, letting small truths leak into places where people were likely to notice. I sent a carefully worded message to his wife with all the documentation, time-stamped and clear, in a tone that had only one purpose, to let her decide what she wanted to do with the truth. I wrote no vitriol. I wrote no judgments. I furnished the facts and left the rest to her. That message was the fulcrum. I felt guilty in a way that was different from cowardice or malice. It was the guilt of someone who had to break trust to prevent further harm. If you're keeping count at home, that's a moral calculus all of us make at different points. Is exposing a painful truth worse than letting the harm continue? For me, the latter was intolerable. When she confronted him, it wasn't the melodramatic scene you see in movies. It was messy and raw. There were accusations, yes, but also the quietness I remember most. The way her gaze turned once to their kids, as if making a decision about their safety was a kind of final determination. He moved out to his parents' house, the kind of exile that looks like a punishment, but sometimes functions as a respite. While he was gone, my brother and I did not speak. He had blocked me in the ways that people block to feel less accountable, but you can't block a moral ledger.
What he couldn't block were the tangible repercussions. Once the truth was alive, the social fallout began to hum like an engine. People who'd been comfortable remaining neutral began to speak. The friends who had whispered behind closed doors now had to account for their silence. Some apologized, and I watched the apologies land like improvised bandages over deep wounds. My job then was to ensure that silence carried a cost. I set up meetings with people who had influence on his social life, his closest friends, the parents of his child's teammates, people who would be uncomfortable keeping lunch with someone who had hurt their friend's family. I presented the facts calmly, like a clinician presenting a diagnosis. There were gasps, and there was an old-fashioned cascade of identities falling away. The good guy image that had shielded him was no longer so impenetrable. I want to pause and address something here, because it matters. Revenge in this form is not vindictive in the way people imagine. It is corrective. There's a difference. Revengeful wants to demolish. Corrective revenge wants to remove social cover and make the perpetrator face the consequences of choice. That was what I wanted. For him to look up and see that the world he had taken for granted would not make space for his evasion. A close call came a month in. One of the relatives who had known all along decided in a last-ditch attempt to protect him to publicly discredit the evidence. They drafted a story about miscommunication and the distance of travel nursing, and they began to plant doubts in family group chats. Suddenly, the court of public opinion, that messy, relentless tribunal, was rewriting the story in ways that would let him off the hook. I felt panic, a physical tightening, because for a second, I imagined all our work being redirected into a narrative of mistake rather than choice. So I moved faster. I presented the timeline with receipts. I laid out the messages and the meetings and the photos. My cousin, who had been wavering, finally said she couldn't lie anymore. She admitted she had known and had not spoken, and the admission shifted the balance of the family conversation. There is nothing that kills a manufactured narrative faster than first-person admission of error. The climax of the social downfall was not a single moment, but a collapse. A sequence of doors closing. Fathers who had once called him for weekend projects now hesitated. The PTA president, who had been friendly with the family, scheduled a meeting and suggested that perhaps the kids needed stability and the parents' relationship was complicated. Employers began asking questions. Travel nursing agencies are, ironically, small towns masquerading as corporations. Reputation travels. My brother's assignments dried up. It was not instant justice. There was no dramatic moment where he fell from an ivory tower, but the accumulation of micro-consequences landed. There were moments I almost apologized to myself for the cruelty of watching it happen. I would see him sitting on the porch of his parents' home and remember him as the boy who taught me how to skip a stone. Memories complicate righteousness. But I couldn't let nostalgia dilute the need for consequence. The children deserve parents who had to reckon with their choices, not parents who were insulated by collective silence. One evening in the quiet after the worst of the storm, my brother showed up at my door. He hadn't been drinking. He looked smaller, and the kind of smallness that comes from being stripped of one's social cushioning is a peculiar humility. He asked in a voice that had been punished by regret whether there was any way back. I told him there were paths, but they were narrow. Honesty, therapy, rebuilding trust through action rather than words. That might sound merciful, and in truth, I was trying to be. I was also trying to be practical. Revenge that becomes spiteful corrodes the avenger. I refuse to let myself become that. But let us not tidy this story with the false comfort that paying the social price repaired everything. It did not. His marriage was over for the time being. She had moved back with her parents with the children and was, understandably, distant and raw. Family dinners were awkward for months. Holidays were like three-dimensional chess games where everyone tried not to be the next pawn sacrificed. My parents' marriage leaned into its own fissures as they realized how easily loyalty had covered wrongdoing. Our family was smaller after the truth became public. People chose sides because pain forces choices. The revenge had achieved what I wanted. The silence that had protected him was gone. But the cost was also mine to carry. There were consequences I hadn't fully predicted. My brother's children began to ask questions that children misframe in ways that adults can't fix with a simple explanation. They asked why Daddy wasn't around to tuck them in. They observed, with terrible bluntness, the absence of both parents in ways that made me want to fix the world with a single magical gesture. I couldn't. Exposure can't mend a child's immediate need for stability. That was a truth that haunted me at night. For all
my righteous fury, I had to accept that exposing the truth created collateral damage, and that the only way through was to be present for those kids in whatever ways I could, without replacing their parent. Along the way, people asked me to forgive him, as if forgiveness could be assigned like a homework assignment. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a public transaction. It is a private, often ongoing decision. Forgiving doesn't mean the wrongdoing's excused. It's possible to forgive and also to insist on accountability. I tried to hold both truths, that people are capable of change and that actions have consequences. That balance is thin, and not everyone will like it. And somewhere in the middle of the aftershocks, I realized revenge had shifted me in ways I hadn't expected. I had become more precise in how I spoke, more careful with judgments, more aware that when you break a social contract, you create ripples that affect innocence. I also learned the value of testimony. Speaking up had been a violent act, in the sense that it altered lives. But it was also the only form of repair I could imagine. I had wanted the world that had enabled his choices to feel uncomfortable, and it did. People who had once protected the protector now felt the weight of their silence. And from that, some real apologies began to emerge. Apologies are clumsy things. They rarely fix everything. But they are the beginning of something that, if tended, could become accountability. I want to tell you about the day he lost the job that, for him, felt like punishment. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gallows, no public shaming in a courthouse. It was a quiet email from a coordinator saying they were shifting their staffing for compliance reasons. He packed his bag and left for a different state. And I remember watching him at the airport, the way he walked with his shoulders hunched. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt like a child watching another child being punished. There was a moral queasiness to it. The knowledge that the consequences arrived not because I wanted to wield some power, but because the systems he had relied on, social, professional, no longer afforded him the benefit of doubt. He had squandered it. When the dust settled, family functions became exercises in new rules. There were fewer invitations, more guarded conversations. We learned to talk around the elephant of infidelity with less elegance. It was a quiet, lingering sorrow. But it was also true that his wife had stopped being a secret keeper for other people's comfort, and she began slowly to remake her life in ways that were not always visible to us. She found a job with better hours, enrolled in classes, and most importantly, started to look like herself again. Not in terms of weight or the superficial metric my brother had used to excuse his behavior, but in terms of agency and brightness. Watching her take back parts of herself
was the closest thing to vindication I could imagine. It meant the truth had not simply wrecked things, but allowed someone a chance to rebuild.